Her billionaire husband texted, "Stuck at work."
Happy 31st.
She sat alone for hours. But when the waiter handed her the bill, he whispered, "Your husband is in private dining room number 4 with his fiancée." She slowly walked in and was absolutely shocked when she realized who that woman was. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, your own family story channel. Heavenly God, on this blessed Christmas season, we place our hearts in your hands. Cover this family with your divine peace. Heal every tired soul, lift every silent tear, and restore hope where life has been heavy. Bless every woman here with strength beyond measure, dignity that no storm can shake, and love that returns to her 1,000 times more than she gives. She is the heartbeat of homes, the prayer behind smiles, the power that holds generations together. Lord, bless our families with health, protect our children, calm our worries, and open doors we can no longer push ourselves. Let this Christmas bring light into dark places, unity into broken moments, and warmth into every lonely heart. Keep this family under your protection today and always. Amen. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." 6 years of marriage, 24 years of friendship, one night to destroy them both. Jodi Beatrice knew before she walked into that private dining room. The waiter's eyes had told her everything she needed to know about betrayal, about the husband who wasn't stuck at work, about the best friend who'd been lying for months. But knowing and seeing are different creatures entirely, and what waited behind that brass handle would carve her open in ways she'd spend the next 6 months learning to weaponize. The reservation at Le Bernardin was for 7 o'clock, and she'd arrived wearing the midnight blue Valentino dress Jack had once said made her look like she belonged in old movies, the kind where women were mysterious and untouchable. She'd chosen their usual table overlooking the city, the same spot where he'd proposed 6 years ago, with shaking hands and a voice thick with emotion, telling her she was the first person who'd ever made him feel like he could become someone worth knowing. The waiter materialized with champagne she hadn't ordered. "Compliments of the house, Mrs. Nicholson. Happy birthday." She smiled her thanks and touched the diamond necklace at her throat. Last year's gift, accompanied by whispered promises about growing old together. The same man who'd fallen asleep in her arms just nights ago, murmuring half-conscious gratitude for her patience with his impossible schedule. Her brilliant, ambitious Jack, who worked himself to exhaustion building the career she'd watched him fight for. 7 o'clock dissolved into 7:30. Her phone vibrated against white linen. "Stuck at work. Happy 31st. The typo made something cold settle in her stomach. Jack, obsessed over language, had built his entire reputation on precise communication. He'd spent their early dates correcting her grammar playfully, teaching her the difference between impact and effect. With such gentle enthusiasm, she'd fallen a little more in love with each lesson. He never made careless mistakes. She ordered the Dover sole they always shared, the ritual of feeding each other bites across candlelight, something that still made her feel like they were discovering each other. Kept her spine straight and her expression pleasant whenever the waiter checked with increasingly worried eyes. Other diners glanced over with that particular female recognition, the one that transcends language and culture, the universal acknowledgement of waiting for someone who isn't coming. 8 o'clock arrived with its burden of certainty. 8:30 brought resignation. 9 brought the waiter with his bill folder and something else in his young face, something that looked like moral crisis. "Mrs. Nicholson?" He set down the folder gently, then leaned closer, his voice barely above breath. "I could lose my job for this, but you've been sitting here with such grace, and Your husband is in private dining room 4. He's been there since 6:30. The waiter's eyes held genuine pain. "With his fiancée." The word arrived like something physical, like the moment before a car crash, when time stretches and you see everything with terrible clarity but can't move fast enough to prevent it. Fiancée. Not date, not colleague, not the innocent explanation her mind frantically constructed and discarded. She'd been his wife for 6 years. They'd renewed vows in Santorini last summer, bare feet in ancient sand, while he cried real tears and promised her every tomorrow he had left. Room 4? Her voice came from somewhere outside herself. Past the bar. Second door left. Mum, I'm so sorry. But she was already moving, heels clicking marble in a rhythm that felt like countdown, like the last seconds before detonation. She passed laughing couples who didn't know they were extras in her catastrophe, past mirrors that showed a woman in an expensive dress walking toward the end of something, past the threshold between the marriage she thought she had and whatever truth waited behind that door. Her hand found the brass handle. Voices filtered through, intimate laughter she recognized because it used to be theirs. She could still turn around, could pretend she'd never gotten that text, never heard the waiter's confession, could go home and wake up tomorrow in a world where this was just paranoia, just birthday loneliness making her imagine betrayal where none existed. She turned the handle. The private room was smaller than their wedding had been, more intimate than their bedroom. Candles cast shadows across faces she knew better than her own mirror. Jack sat holding someone's hands across pristine linen, leaning in with that expression of complete absorption he used to reserve for her stories about ordinary days, like every detail of her life mattered more than anything in his own. The woman looked up first, and Jodi's understanding of the universe shattered into fragments too small to ever reassemble correctly. Merrill Berry. Not just Merrill, but her Merrill. 24 years of blood-sister promises made in a childhood treehouse. The girl who'd slept in her bed during her parents' divorce, sharing pillows and secrets and dreams about the women they'd become, who'd held her through her grandmother's funeral when grief felt like drowning, who'd been maid of honor at this very man's wedding, sobbing through vows about soulmates and destiny and love that lasts forever. An engagement ring caught candlelight on Merrill's finger. Jack's face drained of color when he saw her in the doorway, his hands dropping away from Merrill's like he'd been burned. Guilt radiated from him in waves so powerful, Jodi wondered if everyone in the restaurant could feel it. Jodi. Her name emerged, strangled. "This isn't... We weren't expecting..." Merrill smiled. Small and uncertain, almost apologetic, but still a smile. "Oh, happy birthday, Jodi." 3 words that somehow contained the entirety of betrayal, wrapped in familiar sweetness Jodi had trusted since childhood. The room tilted. Her husband, her sister, an engagement ring, happy birthday. Her mind couldn't construct a narrative that made these elements cohere into reality. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand explanations, to collapse on expensive carpet and keen until her throat bled, to become someone unrecognizable who matched the violence of this moment. Instead, she turned and walked out without speaking a single word. Through the restaurant she moved like a sleepwalker, spine straight and head high, past curious diners and the guilty waiter and the maitre d', asking if everything was satisfactory. She handed her valet ticket to a teenager with kind eyes, tipped without counting, and slid into leather seats that still smelled like the perfume she'd applied hours ago in hopeful anticipation. Only alone, driving through city streets blurred by tears she refused to let fall, did memory come flooding back. Their first date when Jack made her laugh so hard she couldn't breathe, his self-deprecating humor about his failing business somehow endearing rather than pathetic. Their wedding when Merrill cried harder than anyone, calling them destiny incarnate. Last week when Jack held her in their kitchen, his lips against her hair, whispering that she'd saved his life in ways he could never repay. She drove home to their penthouse and sat in darkness so complete it felt like existence itself had been turned off. Still wearing the birthday dress, still wearing his diamonds, still wearing the face of a woman whose entire life had just revealed itself to be a carefully constructed lie she'd been too naive to question. Her phone buzzed. Merrill. Please let me explain. This isn't what you think. Jody stared until the words became meaningless shapes, then whispered to empty rooms, "You have no idea what you've started." Outside, the city glittered with a million other stories, other betrayals, other birthdays spent learning that love could wear a smiling face while driving knives between your ribs with surgical precision. Somewhere in that darkness, two people who'd claimed to love her were probably already finding justifications, already convincing themselves their happiness mattered more than her devastation, already rewriting history so they became victims of circumstance rather than architects of cruelty. They didn't know who they'd just destroyed. More importantly, they didn't know who would rise from the ashes. Jody opened her laptop and typed a single email to an address Jack had never known existed. 3 words that would set everything in motion. Begin the extraction. Because the woman crying in an empty penthouse wasn't just a betrayed wife. She was a billionaire CEO who'd spent 6 years playing ordinary, and tomorrow the performance would end. Chapter 2. The Perfect Wife Performance. The next morning, everything looked different. Jody had spent the night making calls to people Jack didn't know she knew, setting mechanisms in motion he'd never understand until they crushed him. But when his key turned in the lock just after 6, she was at the stove in his favorite silk robe, humming and making breakfast like her world hadn't just imploded. The performance of a lifetime was about to begin. Morning arrived with the particular cruelty of sunlight on fresh wounds. Jody had spent the night motionless on their couch, watching the city transform from glittering dark to harsh grey dawn. She'd had 8 hours to decide who she would be when Jack walked through that door, what performance would serve her purposes best. His key turned in the lock just after 6. She heard him trying for stealth, footsteps careful like someone sneaking home after curfew. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted him in the kitchen, where Jody stood at the stove wearing his favorite silk robe, hair pulled back casually, humming something wordless and light. She'd set the table with their wedding china, placed fresh flowers in the crystal vase his mother had given them, squeezed orange juice into glasses they reserved for celebrations. "Good morning, love." She didn't turn from the stove, keeping her voice warm as summer. "How was work?" The silence behind her stretched until it became its own language. Finally, Jack managed words, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "Work was... Jody, we need to talk about something important." She turned with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "About your presentation today, I ironed your blue shirt, the one that makes you look so commanding. It's hanging ready, and I picked up your dry cleaning, so your charcoal suit is perfect too." She set eggs and bacon before his usual chair with the precision of ritual. "Sit, darling. You look exhausted. Another late night?" Jack stood frozen, staring like she'd transformed into someone he didn't recognize. His hair disheveled, tie loosened, shirt wrinkled in ways that suggested other hands had touched it. "You're not... You didn't..." "Didn't what, sweetheart?" She poured his coffee exactly right, the muscle memory of 6 years of mornings. "You seem tense. Is the Morrison account still giving you trouble? I know you've been worried." He took the coffee automatically, fingers wrapping around the mug like he needed something solid to anchor him. His eyes searched her face for cracks, finding none. "Jody, something happened last night. Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was a coward, and now everything's complicated and wrong, and I don't know how." "Jack." She placed her hand over his, touch gentle and reassuring. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. We always do. That's what partnership means, remember? You and me." She kissed his forehead softly. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold. We can talk tonight when you're not so tired, all right?" He stared at her with an expression caught between relief and confusion, guilt and gratitude tangled together. "Tonight. Yes. We'll talk tonight." They both knew he wouldn't. He'd take this unexpected reprieve from confession and run straight back to Meryl's arms. After he left, still bewildered by her reaction or calculated lack thereof, Jody cleaned the kitchen with methodical precision, washed dishes he'd barely touched, threw away breakfast she'd cooked but couldn't imagine eating, straightened things that didn't need straightening, creating order in small ways she could still control. Her phone rang. Meryl's name like an accusation. Jody answered on the third ring. "Hey you, I was just thinking about calling." Tentative breathing then. "Jody, about last night at the restaurant, can we meet? I need to explain things. There's so much context you're missing and I'd love to see you," Jody interrupted. Warmth in her voice that could have been genuine. "I've missed our coffee dates terribly. That little place on 5th, the one with lavender lattes you're obsessed with. 11 work." Silence stretched several heartbeats. "You want to... You're not angry. Angry at my best friend. Meryl, you're my sister. We've survived everything together. Nothing could change that." Jody laughed softly, a sound she'd practiced until it rang true. "Now tell me what's been happening. It feels like we haven't really talked in forever." They met at the cafe precisely on time. Meryl arrived with carefully applied makeup hiding sleepless night, hands fidgeting with her purse strap like it held answers to questions she was afraid to voice. Jody was already there at their corner table, 2 lavender lattes waiting, and she stood to embrace Meryl exactly like always. "I've missed you so much," Jody said into Meryl's hair, feeling her stiffen with surprise before slowly relaxing into familiar comfort. They sat. Meryl stared at her latte like it might reveal the future. "Jody, I don't understand. Last night weren't you there for your birthday?" "I was," Jody said simply, sipping and watching Meryl over the rim. "Jack got stuck at work. It happens. He's under enormous pressure with the expansion." She set down her cup and leaned forward with concern. "But enough about my boring evening. Tell me about this new man. You've been so mysterious, and I'm desperate to hear everything. Are you happy? Really, truly happy?" Meryl's eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine. "I am. God, Jody, I'm terrified by how happy I am. I never knew I could feel like this about someone. Like I've been half asleep my whole life and suddenly I'm awake." She gripped Jody's hand. "He makes me feel seen. Like every part of me matters, even the parts I thought were too much or too broken." "That's beautiful," Jody murmured, squeezing back. "You deserve exactly that kind of love. After everything you've survived, all the heartbreak, you deserve someone who makes you feel whole. You're not upset I haven't told you who he is?" Jody smiled with what looked like understanding. "You'll tell me when the time's right. I trust you completely. I always have." Meryl broke then, crying into her napkin while Jody rubbed circles on her back. "I don't deserve you. I really don't." "Love isn't about deserving," Jody said softly, words she'd spoken countless times throughout their friendship. "It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard." After they parted, Jody sat alone in her car and allowed herself 60 seconds of truth. 60 seconds where her composure shattered and her hands shook and she released one silent scream that rattled her ribcage. Then she checked her reflection, fixed her lipstick, and drove to her next appointment. That evening, she went through Jack's laptop while he showered, found folders with innocuous names hiding months of correspondence. She forced herself to read slowly, to understand not just what they'd done but how they'd justified it. Meryl to Jack. "I know this is messy and complicated, but when have the right things ever been simple? She's had everything handed to her. Stability, security. Never had to fight for anything. Maybe it's finally our turn." Jack to Meryl. "I keep thinking about her kindness. But there's a difference between kind and right for each other. You make me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Meryl to Jack. "Exactly. And she'll be fine. Women like Jodie always land on their feet, but people like us? We have to grab happiness when we find it, even if the timing isn't perfect. Reading their self-justification was worse than malice would have been. They'd convinced themselves they were victims of circumstance, that their love was some cosmic exception to normal morality, that Jodie's imagined resilience made her betrayal somehow acceptable. She closed the laptop before she could read more and sat in darkness, understanding that cruelty rarely announces itself as such. It dresses up as love, as destiny, as the universe finally giving you what you deserve. Later, when Jack slept beside her, peaceful and unburdened by consequences, she whispered to the night, "Let them believe I'm naive. Let them feel safe in their story. The fall is always steeper when you don't see the edge." But what Jack didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that while they'd been falling in love, Jodie had been making calls, restructuring investments, moving pieces on a board they couldn't see. The empire she'd built for him was about to become his prison, and she held every single key. Chapter 3. The Foundation. He never saw. 3 days after the birthday massacre, Jodie sat in a boardroom Jack didn't know existed, surrounded by lawyers who called her Ms. Beatrice with the deference reserved for people who sign their paychecks. On the table before her lay documents that would dismantle her husband's life piece by careful piece. "The extraction timeline you requested," her lead attorney said, sliding a folder across mahogany. "We can begin immediately." Jodie opened it, scanning numbers that represented 6 years of invisible work. Every client she'd delivered, every crisis she'd solved, every miracle she'd orchestrated, while Jack took credit and never questioned his luck. "Phase 1, she said quietly. "Let's remind him what gravity feels like." Days became weeks, and Jack came home later each time with excuses that grew increasingly elaborate. Emergency client meetings that ran past midnight, weekend presentations that required absolute focus, networking events where somehow her presence wasn't appropriate, despite her always being welcomed before. Jodie watched him slip away like watching someone drown in slow motion, each wave pulling him further from reach, until even her outstretched hand couldn't bridge the distance. She never questioned, never accused or demanded or showed even mild disappointment. Instead, his favorite meals waited warm, his clothes appeared pressed exactly how he preferred, their home remained a sanctuary he could retreat to without facing consequences. She became perfection itself in every measurable way, and the confusion it caused him was visible and deeply satisfying. Merrill visited often now, abandoning pretense. She'd arrive with wine and takeout, curl onto Jodie's couch with the comfort of 2 decades, and talk about her mysterious boyfriend with barely contained joy. Jodie would listen and pore and ask supportive questions, while her best friend described falling in love with her husband in details carefully crafted to hide his identity. "He sees me," Merrill said one evening, wine loosening her tongue. "Not just looks at me, but really sees me. All the parts I usually hide because they're too intense or too needy or too much. With him I can just exist without editing myself." She smiled with what looked like wonder. "Do you know how rare that is, to feel completely safe being yourself?" Jodie thought about the person she'd carefully constructed for Jack, the scaled-down version designed to fit comfortably in his life without threatening his sense of self. "No," she said honestly, "I don't think I do." Merrill reached over and squeezed her hand with apparent sympathy. "You will someday, sweetie. You're too wonderful to settle for less forever. When this thing with Jack runs its course, and let's be honest, you've both seemed disconnected lately, you'll find someone who really sees you too." The casual certainty with which Merrill planned Jodie's future, the assumption that she'd simply accept being replaced, made something cold and sharp settle behind Jodie's sternum, but she just smiled and refilled wine glasses, playing her role so perfectly even she almost believed it. Memories came at night when sleep wouldn't. She'd lie beside Jack and remember him from 5 years ago, before confidence had transformed him into someone who could discard love like yesterday's news. He'd been so different then, genuinely broken. His business partner had stolen their best clients and left Jack drowning in debt he couldn't repay. She'd found him late one evening in his tiny office, sitting in darkness with eviction notices spread across his desk like tarot cards predicting doom. "I've lost everything," he'd told her. This man she'd only just started seeing, voice hollow with defeat. "My business, my reputation, probably my apartment next month. Everyone who said I'd never make it was right. I'm not special. I'm just another failure who thought he could be more." She'd held him while he cried, years of rejection pouring out, then pulled back, looked him in the eyes, and said with absolute conviction, "You're not a failure. You're just learning what doesn't work. Let me help." She'd spent that entire night rebuilding his strategy. Within days, an anonymous investor contacted him with terms so generous he'd wept with relief, spinning her around his shabby office and laughing like he'd been granted a second life. "I did it," he'd said, eyes shining. "Baby, I actually saved myself." She'd kissed him and whispered, "I never doubted you." The investor had been her, of course. Her money, her connections, her midnight calls to people who owed her favors. But she'd let him believe he'd rescued himself because she'd seen how desperately he needed that narrative, how essential it was to his healing that he could be his own hero. She'd been doing it ever since, building him up while making herself invisible in the construction. The memories continued, each one now weighted with new understanding. 3 years ago, when his biggest client threatened to leave over Jack's mistake, Jody had accidentally befriended the client's wife at a charity event, spent months becoming her confidant until the wife convinced her husband to stay. Jack thought his apology had worked, never knowing his wife had orchestrated the entire reconciliation. 2 years ago, when a competitor spread lies designed to destroy Jack's reputation, Jody had used connections she'd never mentioned to ensure the competitor's funding evaporated and whispers started about his own ethical violations. Jack had attributed it to karma, never suspecting his wife had demolished someone's career to protect his. Last year, when Jack fell in love with office space he couldn't afford, Jody had bought the entire building through a shell company and had her property manager offer Jack absurdly low rent with explanations about tax advantages. Jack had negotiated for days before accepting, so proud of his business acumen. He'd celebrated his brilliant deal-making over dinner, and she'd smiled and toasted his success and never mentioned she owned the building, the furniture, and probably the restaurant they were dining in. Every triumph he'd celebrated, she'd orchestrated in complete shadow. Every crisis he'd overcome, she'd solved before it could touch him. She'd been the invisible architect of his entire success story. Now, lying beside him while he slept peacefully, untroubled by guilt, she wondered what would happen if she stopped, if she pulled away every invisible support beam she'd placed, if she let him stand alone for the first time since they'd met. She already knew the answer. Her phone buzzed. A message from her actual assistant, the one who worked at the company Jack didn't know she owned. "Board meeting tomorrow, European expansion vote. Need your decision." She typed back, "Approved. Send contracts." Jack stirred, reaching for her unconsciously with the certainty of someone who'd never once considered she might not be there. His hand found hers, squeezed gently, and he murmured something that sounded like her name mixed with gratitude. Her heart cracked despite everything. This flawed, selfish man had been her entire world. She'd built kingdoms for him, destroyed enemies for him, made herself small and quiet so he could feel large and important. And he'd taken every bit of it, and still decided she wasn't enough. She pulled her hand free gently and went to her locked home office. Opened her laptop and reviewed reports from her actual company, quarterly earnings exceeding projections, expansion opportunities across continents, partnership offers from corporations that would make Jack's firm look like a lemonade stand. This was who she really was. Not the supportive wife who made breakfast, not the understanding friend listening to Meryl describe stealing her husband. She was a woman who'd inherited an empire at 24 and tripled its value before 30, who commanded rooms full of men twice her age, who made decisions affecting thousands of lives, and she'd buried every bit of it to be loved by someone who couldn't stay faithful. She opened a secure folder marked JB Holdings and reviewed the extraction timeline her lawyers had prepared. Phase 1 was already in motion, subtle shifts that Jack would barely notice at first, a client expressing concerns, a lease coming up for renewal, banking terms being re-evaluated. By Phase 3, he'd be ruined, but he'd never know why. She whispered to her reflection in dark glass, 6 years I held you up. You thought you were flying. You never looked down to see what kept you airborne. Tomorrow, she'd see Jack off to work with a kiss and a smile. She'd have coffee with Meryl and listen to more lies about the mysterious boyfriend. She'd play the devoted wife and loyal friend so convincingly they'd never suspect the ground was already crumbling beneath their feet. And when they finally fell, when everything collapsed and they scrambled to understand how their perfect lives had turned to ash, she'd be there, not to catch them, to watch. Chapter 4. The Sister Who Became Stranger. 2 weeks after the restaurant, and Meryl still didn't know that Jodie knew. The deception was almost beautiful in its symmetry. Meryl hiding Jack, while Jodie hid the truth about Meryl hiding Jack. Layers of performance so thick that sometimes Jodie wondered if anyone was real anymore, or if they'd all become actors who'd forgotten their original scripts. But tonight, watching Meryl cry on her couch about the complicated timing of her secret relationship, Jodie felt something shift. Not anger exactly, something colder, more final. Because in Meryl's purse, which she'd left open on the counter, Jodie could see the corner of a Valentine's card in Jack's handwriting, the same handwriting that used to fill cards for her. Meryl called on a Tuesday, voice thick with tears Jodie recognized as genuine. "Can I come over? I really need my best friend. Please, Jodie. Everything feels like it's falling apart." She arrived within an hour, eyes swollen, mascara tracking down her cheeks. Jodie pulled her immediately into an embrace, feeling Meryl's body shake with sobs against her shoulder. They stood in the doorway for long minutes, Jodie murmuring comfort she'd offered countless times throughout their friendship. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. We always have." They settled onto the couch with tea and the blanket they'd shared during 1,000 movie marathons and heartbreak sessions. Meryl curled into Jodie's side like a wounded child, breathing gradually slowing to something approaching calm. "I feel so guilty keeping secrets from you," Meryl whispered. "You're my sister, my person, and I'm hiding something huge. It's killing me." Jodie stroked her hair, the dark curls she'd helped Meryl learn to love when they were teenagers struggling with self-image. "You can tell me anything. Nothing you could say would make me love you less." "This man I'm seeing," Meryl's voice muffled against Jodie's shoulder. "It's so serious, life-changing serious, and I want you to know everything about him, to meet him and love him and celebrate with me, but the timing is complicated and I'm terrified of hurting you, and I don't know how—" "Then wait," Jodie interrupted gently. "Don't force something before it's ready. When the moment's right, you'll know. Until then, I'm here, supporting you exactly like I always have." Meryl pulled back to look at her, eyes swimming with fresh tears. "How are you always so understanding? How are you always so good to me when I don't deserve it?" "Because you're my sister. That's what we do." The words tasted like grief, but she said them because Meryl needed to believe them, needed to stay comfortable and careless, and convinced Jodie suspected nothing. After Meryl left, Jodie let herself remember, not the recent betrayal, but the foundation it had destroyed. 24 years of friendship that had built something she'd believed was permanent. She was 7 when they met, both new to an elementary school neither wanted to attend. Meryl had been crying alone under a tree during recess, arms wrapped around her knees. Jody had approached with the fearless compassion only children possess, and sat down beside her. "I'm Jody. Why are you sad?" "My parents are getting divorced," Meryl had whispered. "Everyone at my old school found out and made fun of me, said I came from a broken family." Jody had considered this seriously, then produced the pocket knife she'd stolen from her brother. "We should be sisters then, real sisters, so neither of us is ever alone." They'd pricked their palms in a treehouse that afternoon, pressed bleeding hands together, and sworn an oath that felt sacred in the way only childhood promises can. Forever and always, blood sisters, nothing will ever come between us. For 17 years, nothing had. When Meryl's parents' divorce turned violent and her mother couldn't stop crying long enough to care for her daughter, Meryl had lived with Jody's family for half a year, slept in Jody's bed, wore Jody's clothes, sat at Jody's table while Jody's mother tucked them both in and whispered they were both her daughters now. "You saved my life," Meryl had said during one of those dark nights. "Without you and your family, I don't know what would have happened to me. You literally saved my life." When Jody's grandmother died, and grief felt like drowning, Meryl had held her through 3 days of devastating sorrow, cancelled her own plans, ignored her own responsibilities, simply existed beside Jody in her darkness. She'd run interference with overwhelming relatives, made sure Jody ate and saw sunlight, whispered stories that made her laugh through tears. "Your family is my family," Meryl had said at the funeral. "Your pain is my pain. Always." When Meryl's fiancé abandoned her at the altar in front of hundreds of guests, Jody had found her in the church bathroom, still wearing her torn wedding dress, trying to cut it off with decorative scissors while sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Jody had taken the scissors gently, helped her out of the dress, wrapped her in someone's forgotten coat, and driven her home. She'd stayed for 3 days, holding her through crying fits, reminding her to breathe during panic attacks, forcing small bites of food when Meryl insisted she'd never be hungry again. "Men come and go," Jody had told her, "but we're forever, I promise you that. No man will ever come between us." The irony of that promise now felt like a blade between her ribs. When Meryl lost her job and apartment in the same month years later, Jody had called Jack and convinced him to hire her despite his reservations, had personally trained her, defended her against skeptical colleagues, loaned her money for rent until her first paycheck arrived. "I don't deserve a friend like you," Meryl had cried during late-night training. "I've been such a mess, such a burden, and you just keep showing up." "That's what love means," Jody had replied. "Just showing up. No conditions." 24 years of showing up, of being Meryl's constant through every chaos and celebration, of treating their friendship like the sacred thing they'd sworn it would be in that childhood treehouse. And Meryl had taken all that history and decided Jody's husband was worth more. Now, Jody opened her laptop and forced herself to read the emails again. Not for torture, but for understanding. She needed to see how love transformed into betrayal, how sacred bonds became breakable. Meryl to Jack. "I feel terrible, but I can't help these feelings. She's had everything her whole life, stability, security, never knowing what it's like to fight for happiness. Maybe it's finally our turn to have something good." Jack to Meryl. "She's been so kind through all of this, but kindness isn't passion. I feel more alive talking to you for 5 minutes than I have in months with her." Meryl to Jack. "She'll be fine. Women like Jody always land on their feet. They're built different, stronger somehow. But people like us? We have to grab happiness when we find it, even if the timing is messy." They'd rewritten her as someone who had life too easy, who wouldn't really suffer, who was somehow less vulnerable to pain because she appeared capable. They'd used her strength as permission for their weakness. An email from Meryl to Jack dated 3 weeks ago made Jody close her eyes. "Sometimes I think she knows and just doesn't care enough to fight for you. Maybe we're not actually hurting anyone. Maybe this is just 3 people finding their way to where they're supposed to be." Meryl had convinced herself that Jodi's quiet acceptance was apathy rather than trust, had interpreted love as indifference because it made the betrayal easier to live with. Jodi closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom closet. In the back, hidden behind rarely worn coats, was a box of photographs spanning their friendship. 2 7-year-olds with matching gap-toothed grins, teenagers with terrible haircuts, college students drunk on cheap wine and infinite possibility, adults at weddings and funerals and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She found the photo she was looking for. Meryl's wedding day, the one that never happened. There in the church bathroom, Meryl in her torn dress, Jodi holding her while she cries. Someone had captured the moment through the cracked door, preserving vulnerability and unconditional support. On the back, in Meryl's handwriting, "My sister, my savior, my forever. I love you more than words exist." Jodi placed the photo face down and closed the box. Her phone buzzed. A text from her head of security. "Target acquired. Surveillance in place. Ready for phase 2 on your command." She'd had them following Jack and Meryl for weeks now, documenting every meeting, every lie, every moment of their carefully hidden affair, not for legal purposes. She didn't need evidence for what she planned. She needed it for precision. Because when she finally revealed what she knew, when she pulled back the curtain on their little performance, she wanted every detail at her fingertips, wanted them to understand exactly how thoroughly she'd been watching, how completely she'd been in control while they thought she was oblivious. She typed back, "Proceed," then whispered to the empty closet, "You wanted my husband more than 24 years of us. Let's see if he was worth it." But even as she said it, Jodi felt something break inside her that had nothing to do with Jack. The friendship with Meryl had been real in ways the marriage never was. Meryl had known the real her, or at least more of the real her than Jack ever did, and still chose to betray her. That hurt worse than anything Jack had done, because Jack had fallen in love with a performance. But Meryl had loved the real Jodi and decided she wasn't worth protecting. That was the wound that would never fully heal. Chapter 5. The Separation. The call came from Jack's lawyer on a Thursday morning. Jodi was in the middle of approving a $300 million acquisition when her personal phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Beatrice, this is Richard Chen from Chen and Associates. I represent your husband, Jack Nicholson, in a matter of marriage dissolution. He'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss terms." Jodi felt something click into place, the final piece of her plan falling exactly where she needed it. "Tell him I'll be devastated," she said quietly. "Tell him I need time. Tell him whatever makes this easiest for him." She hung up and smiled, because Jack asking for a separation meant he was leaving on his own, which meant everything she did next would look like heartbroken reaction rather than calculated destruction. Perfect. Jack made his announcement on a Sunday morning while she was making pancakes, the domesticity almost comedic given the speech he'd rehearsed. She could tell he'd practiced by the careful quality of his voice, like someone reading lines they'd memorized but didn't quite believe. "Jodi, we should talk about our marriage." He stood by the island, not quite meeting her eyes. "I think we need a trial separation, some space to figure out what we really want individually. It's not about you, it's more about me needing to—" "All right," she said simply, flipping a pancake. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the refrigerators hum, coffee makers gurgle, distant traffic from the street below. "All right," Jack repeated, voice cracking. "Just, you're not going to ask why, or try to convince me otherwise, or—" She turned to face him fully, expression calm. "Jack, if you need space to understand what you want, I want you to have that. I love you enough to want your clarity, even if finding it means being apart for a while." She crossed to him and took his hands. "This doesn't mean we're ending. It means we're being honest about needing room to breathe, right? He stared like she'd started speaking another language. This wasn't in his script. He'd prepared for tears, for pleading, for emotional manipulation. Her understanding had completely derailed whatever he'd spent days planning to say. Right, he managed. Just some space. Then let's handle this well, Jody said, already turning back to breakfast. We'll make a plan. You can use the guest room to start, or we can find you a temporary place. Whatever feels most comfortable. I want to support you through this, Jack. That's what partners do. Over the following days, she helped him pack with the same care she'd shown for everything in their marriage. Folded his clothes perfectly. Ensured he had his favorite things, even bought him new linens for whatever apartment he'd get. She never cried, never accused, never once mentioned Merrill or the restaurant or the ring she wasn't supposed to know about. The day he moved boxes into Merrill's apartment, Jody was across town at a charity luncheon, wearing a smile that never wavered and writing a generous check she'd forget about before reaching her car. Merrill texted that evening, "Jack and I are officially living together. I wanted you to hear it from me. I hope we can stay close through this transition. You mean the world to me." Jody stared at the message before typing, "I'm glad you're happy. You deserve love. We'll always be sisters." She meant none of it. The penthouse felt different without Jack, though not emptier. Clearer somehow, like fog lifting to reveal what had always been there. Her space, her sanctuary, her home that she'd been sharing with someone who'd never truly valued what he had. She started reclaiming it, moved furniture to where she'd originally wanted it, played music he'd complained was too aggressive, ate dinner at odd hours because there was no schedule to coordinate with, wore comfortable clothes instead of things he'd preferred seeing her in. Friends she'd neglected during marriage started calling, tentative at first, then warmly welcoming when they realized she was finally available. Gallery openings she'd skipped because Jack found them pretentious. Book clubs she'd quit because meetings conflicted with his needs. Charity events where she could exist as herself rather than as Jack's accessory. At a fundraiser for literacy programs, she spent an hour discussing education reform with a distinguished woman who ran one of the city's most prominent foundations. At the end, the woman handed her a card. "You should attend our next board meeting. We need perspectives like yours." Jody smiled and pocketed it, knowing she already sat on boards this woman would kill to access. Meanwhile, Jack's world began experiencing small earthquakes. Nothing catastrophic yet, just odd occurrences that didn't quite align. A major client mentioned exploring other options. His landlord informed him the building had new ownership and rents were increasing significantly. The bank called about refinancing his business loans at less favorable terms. He mentioned it during one of their awkward coffee meetings, the ones where they pretended to be mature adults navigating separation civilly. "Everything feels slightly off lately," he said, stirring coffee obsessively, "like I'm suddenly unlucky after years of things working out. Does that sound crazy?" "Not crazy," Jody replied gently. "Just stress. Separation affects everything. Once you settle into your new situation, things will stabilize." What she didn't say was that his old stability had been built entirely on her invisible foundation, and she was methodically removing each support to see how long his structure could stand alone. It wouldn't be long now. Her phone buzzed with an update from her lawyers. "Morrison account has officially terminated. Blackwell Industries is reconsidering partnership. Building lease set to triple next month. Proceeding as planned?" She typed back a single word. "Proceed." Merrill called less now, the guilt apparently easing as Jack's presence became permanent. When they did talk, her voice carried defensive edges, like she was preparing for accusations that never materialized. "You're being strange about this," Merrill said during one call. "Most women would be furious. Why are you so calm?" "Because anger won't change reality," Jody answered honestly. "Jack made his choice. You made yours. I can spend energy being bitter, or I can spend it moving forward. You're seriously okay with me being with your husband? The question hung there, bold and challenging, finally dragging unspoken truth into daylight. Jody took a slow breath. You're not with my husband, Meryl. You're with my ex. There's a difference. And yes, it hurts. But I love you both enough to want you happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. Meryl started crying, which seemed her default response to Jody's relentless grace. I don't deserve you. I really don't. Probably not, Jody agreed quietly. But love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. And I choose to love you anyway. After hanging up, she opened her laptop and reviewed reports from her company. Quarterly earnings exceeding projections. European expansion ahead of schedule. 3 partnership offers potentially worth hundreds of millions each. She approved strategic decisions affecting thousands of employees, signed off on acquisitions reshaping market sectors, scheduled meetings with investors controlling more wealth than small countries, then closed the laptop and sat in her pristine penthouse, surrounded by expensive everything, completely alone. For the first time since finding Jack with Meryl, she let herself cry. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears while she stared at city lights and mourned the life she'd thought she was building. She'd loved him, genuinely loved him with devotion that made her reckless and willing to hide empires just to feel ordinary. She'd believed their marriage was real, that their connection mattered more than money or the person she'd carefully concealed. And he'd discarded it all for someone who made him feel excited instead of secure. The cruelest part was understanding why. Meryl represented risk and passion. Jody represented safety and support. Men like Jack, men who'd built confidence on foundations others constructed, often confused safety with constraint. They wanted uncertainty's thrill without understanding that thrill only felt good when you had nets you didn't acknowledge. Jody had been his net for 6 years, and he'd never once looked down to see what held him up. She wiped her tears and scrolled through contacts until she found the name she wanted. A lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the one who'd helped her grandmother build an empire that couldn't be touched or divided or stolen. She didn't call. Not yet. But knowing the option existed gave her control that felt almost as good as the love she'd lost. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ms. Beatrice, Tokyo investors confirmed. They're very interested in partnership. This could be our biggest deal. Congratulations. She stared at the message, then at her empty penthouse. Biggest deal in company history. Hundreds of millions. International expansion. Everything she'd worked for since inheriting her grandmother's legacy. And no one to celebrate with. No one who knew. No one who would understand the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished while watching her marriage crumble. She typed, "Schedule the meeting," then poured wine, raised it to her reflection and whispered, "Here's to building kingdoms alone." But even as she said it, another part of her whispered something darker. "Here's to showing him what happens when you take queens for granted." Because the truly devastating part of her plan wasn't the money Jack would lose or the career that would crumble. It was that he'd lose it all while never understanding why. He'd spend years wondering what went wrong, analyzing his decisions, questioning his luck, and he'd never know that his downfall had a name, that it had been orchestrated by the woman who'd once loved him enough to make him feel invincible, the woman he'd loved just enough to abandon. Chapter 6. The foundation crumbles. The call came on a Wednesday while Jack was reviewing presentations, trying to understand why contracts that seemed certain kept dissolving like smoke. His secretary's voice carried unusual tension. "Mr. Nicholson, there's a Mr. Patterson from Consolidated Holdings. He says it's urgent about your business arrangement." Jack's stomach dropped. He'd been avoiding thoughts about that arrangement, the miracle investment that had appeared when he was drowning, the anonymous benefactor who'd asked for so little in return. Or so he'd thought. "Jack Nicholson," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Mr. Nicholson, I'll be direct. The investor who holds position in your company has decided to liquidate. They're calling in their stake immediately. The room tilted. That's impossible. I took a loan, yes, but I've been current on payments. There's no stake to call in. I'm afraid there is. The funding you accepted included equity transfer, standard practice for this type of rescue financing. The investor owns controlling interest and is exercising their right to liquidate. You have 30 days to buy out their position at current valuation, or the company will be sold. The number Patterson quoted made Jack's vision blur. More than his company was worth, more than he could possibly access, more than existed in any reality he could navigate. A death sentence wearing business language. Who is this investor? Jack demanded. I have a right to know who's destroying me. They've chosen to remain anonymous. My firm manages their holdings through corporate structures. I can't provide that information. After the call, Jack sat staring at nothing until his secretary knocked to ask if he was all right. Nothing was all right. His business, the thing that defined him and proved his worth, was being ripped away by a ghost he'd never met. Over the next week, it deteriorated. 2 major clients terminated contracts, citing restructuring and new directions that somehow didn't include his services. These were accounts he'd held for years, relationships he'd nurtured, revenue he'd counted on. Their departure left wounds that couldn't heal quickly enough to prevent collapse. His landlord informed him the building had new ownership and his lease wouldn't renew. Comparable spaces cost 3 times what he'd been paying. Prices he'd somehow never noticed were absurdly low. Another gift he'd taken for granted. Banks called about his accounts, asking questions about declining assets and suggesting financial advisors. Credit cards declined at restaurants. Limits reached on cards he'd barely used because money had always just been there. Merrill noticed the stress, though she seemed more irritated than concerned. She'd moved Jack in expecting the successful businessman she'd seen, someone who could afford nice things and weekend escapes. Instead, she was getting someone who stared at spreadsheets until midnight and jumped at phone calls. When does this settle down? She asked over breakfast, tone sharp. You keep saying it's temporary, but everything keeps getting worse. Were you honest about your finances? I didn't lie, Jack said, exhaustion making him defensive. Something's happening, like someone systematically dismantling everything I built. None of this makes sense. Or maybe, Merrill said carefully, you weren't as successful as you appeared. Maybe Jody was supporting you somehow and now reality's catching up. The words hit like a slap because they echoed his growing fear. But Jody was just a consultant working from home. She didn't have connections or resources to support an entire business, did she? He started researching late at night while Merrill slept, obsessively digging into his company's history, found the original documents, read through legal language he'd signed without fully understanding. There it was. Equity transfer, controlling interest, liquidation rights. How had he missed this? The shell company holding his equity was called J.B. Holdings. The letters seemed familiar, tickling memory without connecting. Then he researched the clients who'd left, trying to find patterns. The only connection was timing, all coming to him around the same period, all through referrals he couldn't quite trace to a single source. His mother called during this spiral. Jack, I received a letter from a law firm about my medical bills from years ago. She paused, breathing shakily. They were paid by a private benefactor. They're just now telling me who. It was Jody, honey. She paid over $200,000 to save my life and never told anyone. Never asked for thanks. Just quietly made sure I didn't die. Each word landed precisely, carefully aimed at whatever remained of his sense of self. That's not possible, he whispered. Jody doesn't have that kind of money. I don't know what she has or how, his mother replied, voice hard, in a way he'd never heard. But I know she saved my life while you were too proud to ask for help. And I know you left her. Jack, what did you do? After hanging up, he sat in darkness, surrounded by evidence of a life he was starting to suspect had never been his. Every success, every break, every miracle at the right moment. He typed with shaking fingers. Jody Beatrice, CEO. The search results loaded, and his understanding of reality shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Articles, photos, interviews with someone who looked exactly like his wife, but dressed in power and standing with people he recognized from business magazines. Headlines about a young billionaire who'd transformed her grandmother's holdings into an empire. Jody Beatrice, heir to Beatrice fortune, revolutionizes traditional industries. At 31, Jody Beatrice proves she's more than her family name. The private billionaire. How Jody Beatrice built an empire while shunning spotlight. Photos of her at events he'd never known about, wearing jewelry that could fund his yearly salary, on panels with politicians and moguls and leaders, a whole life he'd never seen. He clicked through articles, each revealing another layer. She ran a corporation worth billions. She sat on major boards. She'd been named among most influential business leaders. She controlled holdings across continents. And she'd hidden all of it. Not hidden. That wasn't right. She'd hidden it for him, so he could feel successful, so he could believe he'd built something himself, so his pride wouldn't be wounded by reality that his wife was exponentially more powerful than he'd ever be. The investor destroying his company, the clients who'd appeared mysteriously, the office he'd somehow afforded, his mother's medical bills, every miracle, all Jody. She hadn't been his wife. She'd been his invisible architect, his silent partner, his unnamed benefactor, his anonymous savior. She'd constructed his entire life and let him believe he'd done it himself, and he'd repaid her by choosing someone else. Jack ran to the bathroom and vomited until nothing remained but dry heaves and bile. When he emerged, Merrill stood in the doorway looking concerned but mostly annoyed at being woken. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Jack whispered. "Everything." He showed her the articles, watched her face transform from confusion to shock to something resembling fear. They read in silence, scrolling through evidence of Jody's secret empire. "She's a billionaire," Merrill said finally, voice hollow. "Your wife is a billionaire." She looked at Jack with wide eyes that held the first stirrings of real understanding. "Did you know any of this?" "Nothing," Jack replied, voice breaking. "She worked from home, did consulting, made dinner. I thought I was providing for her." Merrill stood abruptly, pacing. "This doesn't make sense. Why would someone with that kind of money hide it? Why live like normal? Why let you think you were supporting her?" But Jack knew why. He understood with clarity that made his chest ache. She'd hidden it because she wanted to be loved for herself, not her wealth. She'd wanted a partner who saw her as a person. She'd wanted marriage that felt equal, even if maintaining that required hiding enormous parts of herself. And he'd taken that gift and thrown it away for someone who made him feel bigger than he was. "The investor destroying my company," Jack said quietly. "It's her. Always has been. She saved me years ago, and now she's taking it back." Merrill's face went pale. "She knows about us. She's known the whole time." "Of course she knows," Jack said, hysterical laughter bubbling up. "She's a billionaire who controls more information than we can imagine. She probably knew before we did." He thought about mornings when Jody made breakfast after he'd spent nights with Merrill. Supportive conversations where she'd encouraged him to take space. How she'd helped him pack, smiled when he left, never once broken down. She hadn't been in denial. She'd been in complete control, watching them perform their betrayal while systematically dismantling the empire she'd built for him. "We need to talk to her," Merrill said urgently. "Apologize, explain, make this right. Jack, if she's that powerful, she could destroy both of us." "She already is," Jack replied, staring at his laptop where Jody's face smiled from some corporate photo, looking powerful and nothing like the soft wife who'd made him feel capable. "This is just the beginning." His phone buzzed. An email with a single attachment. An invitation to a Christmas party. The message was simple. I think it's time we talked. All three of us. JB. Merrill read it over his shoulder, breathing quick and shallow. What do we do? We go, Jack said quietly. We face what we've done. But even as he said it, Jack knew facing it wouldn't be enough. Because somewhere in a penthouse he'd taken for granted, a woman he'd never really known was planning something. And whatever it was, he'd earned every devastating second of it. Chapter 7. The Man Who Had Everything. The invitation said 8 o'clock. The address was a mansion Jack had driven past 100 times without ever wondering who lived there. Now he knew. Now he understood that every time he'd admired it from the road, he'd been looking at a home his wife owned, while she came back to their modest penthouse and pretended to be ordinary. The betrayal of that hit harder than the affair itself. She'd loved him enough to live small, and he'd loved her so little he'd never questioned why. Jack couldn't tell Merrill everything he'd discovered. Not because he wanted to protect her, but because speaking it would make it real in ways his mind still refused to fully accept. He'd married someone who could purchase his entire existence with pocket change, and he'd never suspected. The realization made him question every memory, recontexting 6 years through this devastating new lens. He spent days trying to salvage what remained of his business while knowing it was pointless. The anonymous investor had set a buyout price he couldn't meet, and every attempt to raise capital hit strategically placed obstacles. Banks that had courted his business suddenly found reasons to decline. Potential investors expressed interest, then vanished after background checks. His professional network evaporated like morning fog. His lawyer, reviewing everything with growing concern, finally asked, "Who did you anger, Jack? This level of coordinated demolition doesn't happen accidentally. Someone with serious influence wants you finished." "My wife," Jack replied quietly. "I think I angered my wife." Merrill's behavior shifted as Jack's circumstances deteriorated. The adoring girlfriend gradually revealed something else beneath. She complained about cheap wine, about restaurants he could no longer afford, about cancelled weekend plans. Her affection seemed directly tied to his bank balance, cooling as accounts emptied. He came home one evening to find her on the phone, voice low and intimate. "I know, baby, I know. Just a few more weeks and this situation resolves, I promise." She noticed Jack and quickly ended the call, smile too bright. "That was just my sister. Family drama." Merrill didn't have a sister. Jack said nothing. Just walked to the bedroom and lay in darkness, wondering when his life became layers of lies he couldn't track. He was living with someone cheating on him, while they'd both cheated on someone who'd been supporting them entirely. The irony would be funny if it wasn't his reality collapsing. He started watching Jodie from a distance, knew where she'd be because her schedule had been shared knowledge during marriage, and apparently she hadn't changed routines. Or maybe this was just what he could see of her real life now. At a charity fundraiser, she stood among people radiating power. She wore a dress that probably cost more than his rent, hair styled in ways he'd never seen, entire bearing transformed from soft wife to someone who commanded rooms by existing in them. A distinguished older man whispered something in her ear. She laughed, touching his arm briefly, and Jack felt jealousy so intense it stopped his breath. Not because he had claim to her, but because he was watching her be the person she'd always been while he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. Later he followed her to a business lunch, watching through restaurant windows as she conducted what was clearly high-stakes negotiation. 3 men in expensive suits listened intently, taking notes, nodding agreement. She was brilliant, commanding, completely in her element. This was who she'd been all along, and she'd buried it like shameful secret because he'd needed to feel successful. His phone rang. His mother. "I've been thinking about what I said, about Jodie paying my bills. Jack, did you ever ask about her family, her background, what she did while you worked?" The question hit harder than accusation. Had he asked? Had he shown genuine curiosity about the woman he married, or been too focused on himself? He remembered early dates, how she'd deflected questions about work with vague answers. He'd accepted without pressing because it let him talk about himself, his dreams, his plans. He remembered asking once about her family, and she'd mentioned her grandmother owned a business. He'd assumed something small, never following up. Their entire relationship, he'd been the center of every conversation, and she'd let him, supporting his self-absorption with patience that must have cost enormously. "I didn't ask," Jack whispered. "I never really asked." "That's what I thought," his mother replied. "Jack, that woman gave you everything, not just money. She gave you her belief, her invisible work, her willingness to be less so you could feel like more. And you chose someone else. I raised you better." "I know," he said, voice breaking. "I destroyed the best thing in my life." "Then you need to figure out how to live with that. Because she owes you nothing, and from what I can see, she's doing fine without you." The invitation to Jodi's Christmas party sat on his counter like prophecy. Merrill kept asking about attire, whether to arrive together, whether this was olive branch or trap. Jack had no answers because nothing about this followed patterns he understood. The night before the party, sleep wouldn't come. He kept thinking about moments that now made sense. Times Jodi was on her phone late and said it was emails, when she'd probably been running a company. Occasions when she'd suggested business strategies that worked perfectly, strategies he'd assumed came from consultant training when they'd probably come from actual expertise leading corporations. How she'd never seemed stressed about money, never questioned purchases, because his entire financial situation was rounding error in her real budget. He started reviewing old photos, looking for missed clues. Their wedding, where she wore a simple dress she'd called inexpensive. He zoomed in on the necklace and did reverse image search. Vintage Cartier, worth roughly $500,000. She'd worn a fortune to their wedding and called it simple. First anniversary photo showed the expensive watch she'd given him, insisting she'd saved for months. He looked at the watch on his wrist and wondered if she'd bought it with the same thought he'd give purchasing coffee. Every gift, every gesture, every support had been effortless for someone with her resources. Yet she'd packaged it all as sacrifice, as devotion, as proof of love. Not to manipulate, but because she'd wanted him to feel valuable in their relationship. The cruelty of his betrayal hit fully. She'd surrendered her true self to love him, and he'd surrendered her for someone using him exactly as he'd unconsciously used Jodi. Merrill emerged from the bedroom. "Can't sleep either?" Distance existed between them now that hadn't before. "I've been thinking about tomorrow. What we'll say." "What is there to say?" Jack asked. "Sorry we betrayed you while you were building our lives? Sorry we took everything and demanded more?" Merrill pulled back, defensive. "Don't group me with you. I didn't know she was your wife when we got close. By the time I knew, I'd already fallen in love." The lie was blatant. "You were her best friend for over 20 years. You knew exactly who she was." "And you were her husband," Merrill shot back. "You made vows. I just fell in love with someone already leaving his wife." They stared at each other, two people who'd bonded over betrayal now turning on each other because no one else remained to blame. "Why did you do it?" Jack asked. 24 years of friendship. Why throw that away?" Merrill's face twisted. "Because I was tired of being the one she saved. Tired of being her project, her good deed. Do you know what it's like loving someone who sees you as something to fix?" "She never saw you that way," Jack said, though uncertainty crept in. "She saw everyone that way," Merrill replied, "including you. We were both her rescue projects. I just got tired of being rescued." The insight was cruel and possibly true. Had Jodi loved him or loved saving him? Had their marriage been about genuine connection or her need to be needed? Or was he just rewriting her motives to justify what he'd done? "Tomorrow," Merrill said finally, "we go in with dignity. We don't apologize for falling in love. We show her we're happy." But when Jack looked at Merrill, at this woman who'd helped him betray someone who'd only supported him, he felt nothing resembling love, just exhaustion and regret, and crushing weight of consequences he'd never seriously considered. "Dignity," he echoed hollowly. "Right." Next morning he stood before his mirror trying for presentable. The suit was one of his best, though he now knew Jody had probably paid for it. His watch was from her, cufflinks from her. Even the cologne had been her gift, chosen because she'd said it made him smell like home. He looked at his reflection and saw someone built entirely from pieces someone else assembled. Without Jody's invisible support, without her money and connections and tireless work, who was he? What had he actually accomplished alone? The invitation said 8. The address was in an area where houses cost more than most earned in lifetimes. Merrill emerged in a dress bought before realizing Jack's finances were collapsing, back when she thought she was landing a successful catch. "Ready?" Artificial brightness. "No," Jack replied honestly, "but I don't think that matters." They drove in silence to an estate that stole his breath. Massive gates opened to winding drive lined with lights. The mansion belonged in magazines, all elegant architecture and manicured grounds and old money that had been accumulating power for generations. "This is where she lives," Merrill whispered, face pale. "One of her homes, probably," Jack said, parking among cars, each costing more than his annual salary used to be. They walked toward entrance where beautiful people in expensive clothes laughed and drank champagne. A party celebrating something Jack couldn't identify. Success, maybe. Power. The kind of life existing in completely different stratosphere than the one he'd been pretending to inhabit. A server offered champagne. Jack took a glass and downed it immediately, needing courage for whatever came next. Then he saw her. Jody descended curved staircase like something from films, wearing emerald that caught light and made her look like royalty. Hair swept up, diamonds glittering, entire presence commanding attention from everyone present. She was devastating and powerful and absolutely nothing like the woman who'd made him breakfast. The crowd parted naturally, people stepping aside with deference. Someone announced her name, and Jack watched his wife, his ex-wife, the stranger he'd married, greet guests with warmth and grace. She hadn't noticed them yet, or maybe she had and was making them wait, making them watch her in her element before acknowledging their existence. Merrill's nails dug into his arm. "We should leave, now. This was a mistake." Too late. Jody's eyes found them across the room, expression unreadable. She said something to the handsome man beside her, tall British accent when he spoke, wearing confidence that came from actual achievement rather than borrowed glory, then started walking toward them with measured pace of someone who owned time itself. "Jack," she said when she reached them. "Merrill, I'm glad you came." She looked different up close. Not just beautiful but formidable, like she could end them with a word and had already decided whether she would. "Jody," Jack managed, "we need to talk. About everything. What I've discovered, what you've been—" "Not here," Jody interrupted smoothly. "This is celebration. I won't ruin it with unpleasant conversations." She smiled without warmth. "But soon, very soon, I promise you'll understand everything." She walked away, leaving them standing in the middle of her party, surrounded by people who clearly belonged in ways they never would, knowing whatever came next would be entirely on her terms. And Jack, watching her go, understood he'd just walked into reckoning dressed as Christmas party. The British man, Edward, Jack would learn later, appeared at Jody's side like he belonged there, which he did, in ways Jack never had, because Edward knew exactly who she was and loved her anyway. That hurt worse than anything else. Chapter 8. The walls close in. The party felt like drowning in slow motion. Every conversation Jack overheard involved sums that made his former salary seem like pocket change. Every interaction revealed another layer of Jodi's life he'd never glimpsed. The woman mingling effortlessly with senators and CEOs bore no resemblance to the person who'd packed his lunches. Merrill had disappeared somewhere, probably hiding in a bathroom having a panic attack. Jack stood alone with his third glass of champagne, watching his ex-wife live a life that made his betrayal seem even more pathetic. Because he hadn't left a dependent wife for excitement. He'd abandoned a queen for a girl who'd never been loyal to anyone. The party swirled around them with surreal quality, conversations about deals worth hundreds of millions, casual name-dropping of politicians and celebrities, laughter from people who'd never known financial anxiety. Jack stood at the edge, holding champagne he couldn't taste, trying to understand how he'd lived with someone for 6 years without glimpsing any of this. Merrill had gone pale beneath makeup, tracking Jodi's movements with sick fascination you'd watch an approaching storm. Every few minutes she'd grip Jack's arm and whisper about leaving, about this being a terrible idea, about Jodi clearly planning something destructive. Jack knew she was right. But leaving felt impossible, like trying to walk away from a crash you caused. A distinguished older woman approached with smile both polite and dismissive. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Margaret Whitehall, on the Beatrice Foundation board. Are you investors?" "I'm her husband," Jack said before thinking. "Ex-husband. We're separated." Margaret's expression shifted to something harder. "Ah, you're that husband." She assessed him thoroughly. She really loved you, you know, made excuses for your shortcomings, defended your character when questioned, believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. Pause. "And you broke her heart. I hope you understand she's better without you." She walked away, and Jack stood there with truth burning in his chest. Of course Jodi's friends knew. Of course she had support systems he'd never met. People who'd watched his betrayal from outside and knew exactly what he'd done. "This is humiliating," Merrill hissed, appearing at his elbow. "Everyone knows who we are. We're exhibits in a museum of terrible people." "We earned it," Jack said quietly. "Don't act noble now," Merrill snapped. "You wanted this as much as I did. You chose to leave her." "I chose to leave someone I never knew," Jack corrected. "That's the problem." Before Merrill could respond, Jodi appeared beside them so suddenly it made Jack jump. "Excitement keeps things interesting?" She looked directly at Merrill. "Though I suppose you'd know about entering spaces that don't belong to you." Merrill's face went white. "Jodi, please. We can talk about this like adults." "Can we?" Jodi interrupted, voice pleasant, but eyes like ice. "Explain how you became involved with my husband. Share your side. Help me understand how 24 years of friendship became less important than a man you'd known 3 years." "It wasn't planned," Merrill stammered. "We just connected. Sometimes people connect in ways they can't control." "You're right," Jodi agreed, "like how I connected with a crying girl outside a grocery store and made her family, or how I connected with a struggling consultant and spent 6 years making his success possible. Connection is powerful. So is what you both chose to do with it." Jack found his voice. "You knew. This whole time you knew." "Of course I knew," Jodi said simply. "From the first message. Did you think I was that oblivious? I watched you both while pretending ignorance. It was almost interesting in a tragic way." "Then why didn't you stop us?" Jack demanded. Jodi's smile was sharp. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. How many lies you'd tell. How much of what I'd built you'd be willing to destroy for excitement." She looked between them. "You both exceeded expectations." Edward appeared at Jodi's elbow, the British man from earlier, touching her gently like someone who had earned the right. "Darling, the Tokyo investors just arrived. Tell them I'll be right there, Edward." She turned back to Jack and Merrill. "We'll have a proper conversation tomorrow. Just us. Noon sharp at my office. Don't be late." She walked away with Edward, leaving them standing like discarded furniture. Merrill broke first, tears streaming. This was a mistake. Coming here, getting involved with you, all of it. She's going to destroy us, Jack. She has the power and we gave her every reason. Jack didn't disagree. He watched Jodie across the room, laughing with people who respected her, being the person she'd always been when he wasn't looking. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Company sale final. Consolidated Holdings purchased your business. Thank you for your service. JB, his company. Gone. Sold while he stood in his ex-wife's mansion, watching her live a life he'd never imagined. He showed Meryl, watched her face crumble. Without his business, he had nothing to offer someone who'd clearly been with him for what he could provide. I need to go, Meryl said suddenly. I can't do this anymore. She practically ran for the exit, leaving Jack alone among strangers who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. He should have followed, maintained their united front, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he watched Jodie, studied how she moved through her world with natural grace, how people gravitated toward her. She was magnetic in ways he'd never noticed because he'd been too focused on himself. Margaret Whitehall appeared beside him again, expression softer. She really loved you, talked about you like you hung the moon, defended you when people questioned, believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. Pause. And you broke her completely. She cried for 3 days before deciding to stop crying and start planning. Planning what? Though he already knew. Your education, Margaret said. She built you from nothing. She wanted you to understand what nothing really feels like. She walked away, and Jack understood tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be conversation. It would be sentencing. He left as the party continued, drove back to Meryl's apartment to find her packing frantically. What are you doing? Leaving, she said without looking up. I'm going to Connecticut. To my real boyfriend. This whole thing is too much. Your what? She finally met his eyes, no guilt remaining. Did you think this was for love, Jack? I was with you because I thought you had money and connections, because Jodie made you seem successful, but you're nothing without her. She left within the hour, and Jack sat in an apartment that had never felt like home, surrounded by ruins of a life he'd torched for something that was never real. His phone buzzed. JB. Tomorrow, noon. You've disappointed enough people already. Time to understand what disappointment costs. Jack stared at the message, then at the empty apartment, then at his reflection in dark windows. Tomorrow he'd learn exactly what he'd thrown away, and exactly what it would cost him. Chapter 9. The Christmas revelation morning arrived cold and unforgiving. Jack had spent the night on Meryl's couch, now his couch since she'd abandoned him for Connecticut and her real boyfriend. The boyfriend she'd been seeing the entire time she'd been with him. Betrayal layered on betrayal until the pattern became almost predictable. At least he understood now how Jodie must have felt watching him with Meryl, that hollow realization that you'd never actually mattered, that you'd been convenient, not chosen. The difference was that Jodie had built him an empire while he was busy betraying her. Meryl had just taken what was left and run when the money dried up. He arrived at Beatrice Holdings at 11:30, giving himself time to understand the scope of what Jodie had built. The building was impressive. Modern glass and steel reaching into the sky with architectural confidence that came from unlimited resources. Inside, employees moved with purpose through spaces designed for both beauty and efficiency. Security had his name on a list. Of course. He was escorted to the top floor, past assistants and executives who barely noticed him, into a waiting area that probably cost more than his entire business had been worth. Through glass walls he could see into Jodie's office. She sat at a massive desk reviewing documents, posture perfect, focus absolute. This was her, the real her. Not the woman who'd made pancakes, but the woman who commanded empires and made decisions affecting thousands. At exactly noon, her assistant appeared. "Miss Beatrice will see you now." Jack walked in on unsteady legs. The view was spectacular, overlooking the city from height that made everything below seem insignificant. Jody stood by windows, back to him, wearing a suit that probably cost what he used to make monthly. "Sit," she said without turning. He sat. She turned finally, and her expression was harder than he'd ever seen. This wasn't the woman he'd married. This was the CEO he'd never known, and she looked at him like a problem to solve rather than a person to love. "Do you know what hurt most?" she asked, walking to her desk but not sitting. Not the affair itself, not even the betrayal with Merrill specifically. What hurt was how little you questioned your own success. Jack opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. 6 years ago you were bankrupt. Then suddenly an anonymous investor appeared with perfect timing. Did you ever wonder who they were, why they chose you? "I thought I got lucky," Jack said quietly. "You did," Jody agreed. "You got me. Every client that saved you I arranged. Every deal that worked I orchestrated. Every time you thought you'd succeeded, it was me making it possible." She finally sat. "I built your entire life, Jack. Every piece. And I did it because I loved you." Her voice softened slightly. "I believed we were partners building something together. I thought if I could just be supportive enough, you'd eventually see me completely and love me anyway." "I did love you," Jack said, voice breaking. "You loved what I provided," Jody corrected. "You loved the version of yourself my support created, but you never loved me because you never knew me." She slid documents across the desk. "That's the sale of your company. I bought it, then sold it to competitors who'll dismantle it completely." Jack felt like he couldn't breathe. "Your professional reputation is compromised through strategic whispers. No one will hire you at the level you're accustomed to." Another document. "That's a check. Enough to start over somewhere else. Not enough to maintain the lifestyle you enjoyed with me, but enough to survive if you're careful." "Why give me anything?" Jack asked through tears. "Why not just destroy me completely?" "Because despite everything, I don't want you to suffer forever. I want you to understand what you had and what you threw away. I want you to build something real this time, something actually yours, so you can learn the difference." She stood. "There's a condition. You never contact me again. You never speak about our marriage publicly. You take the money, rebuild somewhere else, and leave me alone." "Jody, please." Jack stood too, reaching for her. "Please give me one more chance. I'll spend my life proving I can love you right." She pulled away gently. "Jack, I spent 6 years being someone I'm not for you. I'm done making myself smaller. I need to find someone who can love all of me from the beginning. Someone like Edward." "Maybe," she said honestly. "He knows exactly who I am. We're equals in ways you and I never were because I never let us be." She walked him to the door. "Take the job offer I included. Go to Seattle. Build a real life. And maybe someday you'll understand." "Is there any chance?" Jack asked desperately. "Any possibility we could try again?" Jody paused, hand on the door. For a moment, something softened in her expression. Not hope exactly, but not absolute closure either. "Ask me in a decade," she said quietly. "When you've become someone who knows his own worth without someone else building it for you. When you understand what love actually requires." She met his eyes. "But I'm not promising anything. I'm moving forward, and you need to as well." At the door, Jack turned back. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing you. For taking you for granted. For choosing so poorly." "I know," Jody replied, "and I'm sorry too. For hiding myself. For enabling your dependence. For loving you enough to lose myself. We both made mistakes. I'll never forget you." "Good," Jody said, smile sad but genuine. "Remember me. Remember what real love should look like. And when you find it again, do better." She opened the door. "Goodbye, Jack." "Goodbye, Jody." He walked out without looking back, drove away with tears streaming and a job offer representing both punishment and mercy. Meanwhile, Jody stood at her window, watching Jack's car disappear. She cried properly now, letting out grief she'd held back. Grief for what could have been, for Meryl's destroyed friendship, for 6 years spent being someone she wasn't. Her phone rang. Edward. How did it go? Exactly how it needed to, Jody replied, wiping her eyes. Dinner tonight? You shouldn't be alone. That sounds perfect. After hanging up, she walked through her office, really seeing it. This was her achievement, her empire. She'd built this while pretending to be ordinary, and now she got to live in it as her full self. She pulled out the photo of her and Meryl as children, looked at their promises, felt the betrayal's full weight one final time, then placed it in a drawer and closed it firmly. Some losses you grieve, some people you forgive, some chapters you close before starting new ones. But as she sat in her office overlooking a city she'd helped build, Jody felt something unexpected. Not just relief, not just sadness, but possibility. For 6 years she'd made herself small to fit someone else's needs. Now, finally, she could be exactly who she was meant to be, and maybe, just maybe, find someone who wanted exactly that. Chapter 10. The Queen's Choice. 18 months later, Jack's hotel room in Seattle had transformed from temporary shelter to something resembling home. He'd taken the job Jody offered, spent months rebuilding not just his career but his understanding of who he was without her invisible support. It had been humbling, devastating, necessary. But on a Tuesday morning when his phone rang with an unknown number, his heart still jumped, hoping it might be her. Mr. Nicholson, this is Patricia Chen from Beatrice Holdings. Ms. Beatrice has requested a meeting. Today, if possible. Jack's hands started shaking. Why? She didn't say. Only that she'd appreciate your time. 2 o'clock at Café Artemis downtown. Will you attend? Yes, Jack managed. I'll be there. He spent 3 hours trying on different outfits, each more pathetic than the last. Settled finally on simple, honest presentation. No pretense, no performance, just himself. The cafe was small, intimate, the kind of place that valued conversation over status. He arrived 20 minutes early and ordered coffee he didn't drink. Jody walked in at exactly 2, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of power suits. She looked younger, lighter somehow, like she'd shed weight she'd been carrying for years, beautiful in ways he'd never fully appreciated. She spotted him immediately, smiled cautiously, and crossed to his table. Jack, thank you for coming. I'll always come, he said honestly. For the rest of my life, if you ask, I'll show up. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, years of history pressing down. You look well, Jody said finally. Seattle agrees with you. I'm learning who I am without you building me, Jack replied. It's been harder than I imagined, but necessary. Jody nodded, stirring coffee she hadn't touched. I've been following your progress. The consulting firm loves your work. They promoted you. You've been watching me. I never really stopped, Jody admitted. Old habits, but not in the same way. Not to control or fix, just to make sure you were okay. Are you okay? Jack asked. Really? Jody considered this seriously. I am. For the first time in years, I'm actually okay. I'm seeing someone, Edward, you met him at the party. He's kind and treats me as an equal. He sees all of me. The words should have hurt. Instead, Jack felt relief. I'm glad. You deserve that. And you? Jody asked. Are you seeing anyone? I am, actually, Jack said. Sarah. She teaches 3rd grade. Makes me laugh. Knows exactly who I am, including all my failures, and likes me anyway. He smiled. She doesn't take my shit, which I apparently needed. Good, Jody said warmly. I'm happy for you. They sat in comfortable quiet, the kind only possible between people who've seen each other at their worst. Why did you want to meet? Jack asked finally. Jody took a breath. Because I've been carrying something for 18 months. Anger at you, at Merrill, at myself. I thought destroying your career would make it better, it didn't. I thought moving on with Edward would erase what happened. It hasn't. She met his eyes. I wanted to tell you that I forgive you. Completely. Not because you've earned it, but because holding on to it was poisoning me. Jack felt tears burn. Jody, let me finish, she said gently. I forgive you for the affair, for choosing Merrill, for taking everything I built without appreciation, but I also need you to understand something. She leaned forward. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was that you never tried to know me, 6 years married, and you never once asked about my work, my family history, my dreams beyond being your wife. You were content with the version of me I performed because it required nothing of you. The truth hit like a physical blow. You're right. I was so focused on myself I never saw you. And that's why we could never work, Jody continued. Even if I forgive you, even if we still care about each other, we were fundamentally unequal. I made myself small. You let me. That pattern would just repeat. Would have repeated, Jack corrected quietly. I'm not that person anymore. I know, Jody said, something like pride in her voice. I can see the change. You've done real work on yourself. Because losing you destroyed me, Jack said, because I finally understood what I'd had and what I'd thrown away. They sat with that truth. Is there any chance? Jack asked, hating how desperate he sounded. Not now, I know. But someday? Jody considered this carefully. I don't know. Maybe when we're both fully healed. Maybe when you've built a whole life that's truly yours, and I've lived fully as myself. Maybe when we can meet as equals who choose each other rather than one person rescuing another. So not never? Not never, Jody agreed. But not soon, and not promised. Jack nodded, accepting what he couldn't change. Thank you. For the meeting. For forgiving me. For giving me the chance to rebuild. Thank you for showing up, Jody replied. For being honest. For becoming someone better. She stood to leave, and Jack stood too. Jody, one last thing. I'm sorry. For all of it. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I know, she said simply. And I'm sorry too. For not demanding better from you. For hiding instead of being honest. We both failed each other. She kissed his cheek gently. Live well, Jack. Be happy. And if someday we're both ready, maybe we'll find our way back to each other. But don't wait for me. Build your life. You too, Jack said. Be happy with Edward. Be yourself completely. You deserve that. She smiled, walked away, and Jack watched her go without following. For the first time since their marriage ended, it felt like closure. Real closure. Not the end of love, but the end of who they'd been to each other. Opening space for who they might become separately. And maybe, someday, together again. But only if they both became whole first. Meanwhile, Jody walked through Seattle streets feeling lighter than she had in years. She'd forgiven Jack, released Merrill's memory, let go of anger that had been eating her alive. She'd built an empire, found someone who loved all of her, become the woman she'd hidden for so long, and she'd done it by being brave enough to destroy what wasn't working and build something true instead. Her phone rang. Edward. How did it go? Better than I expected, Jody said honestly. I think we're both going to be okay. Good. Because I have a question for you. What kind of question? The kind that requires champagne and a quiet dinner. Are you free tonight? Jody smiled, understanding what he was asking. I'm free. 3 months later, Edward would propose over dinner in London. I'm asking to be your partner, your equal, someone who celebrates your success instead of feeling threatened by it. Jody would say yes, not because Edward rescued her, but because he saw all of her and loved all of her from the beginning, because she'd learned that real love doesn't require you to shrink. It demands you to be yourself completely, and find someone brave enough to love exactly that. Years later, Jack would send a wedding announcement from Seattle. He'd married Sarah, the teacher who didn't take his shit. They'd built a small consulting firm together, something modest but genuinely successful. His note would be brief. Found real love. Thank you for teaching me what that means. J. Jody would smile reading it, genuinely happy, then put it in a drawer alongside Meryl's childhood photo. Because queens don't go backward. They build new kingdoms, better ones. Jody Beatrice had spent 6 years being less for someone who couldn't appreciate it. Now she spent every day being exactly who she was born to be. And that, finally, was enough. But sometimes, late at night when rain hit her windows and she couldn't sleep, she'd wonder about the path not taken, about the marriage that could have been if they'd both been brave enough to be honest from the beginning, about whether love could have survived truth or if the hiding had been necessary for it to exist at all. She'd never know the answer, and maybe that was the truest tragedy of all. Not that love ended, but that it never got the chance to be real. Still, looking at Edward sleeping beside her, at the life she'd built being completely herself, at the empire she no longer had to hide, Jody understood something important. Sometimes you have to lose what you thought you wanted to find what you actually needed. She'd wanted Jack to love her. She'd needed to learn to love herself. And that lesson had been worth every devastating moment. Outside, the city glittered with possibility. Tomorrow she'd wake up and run her company, make decisions affecting thousands, build her empire higher and stronger, all while being exactly who she was. No performance, no hiding, no making herself small, just Jody Beatrice, Queen of Kingdoms she'd built herself. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The end.